Christianity is not much reflected about Islam, at least in a serious fashion. So I have taken a slightly different angle, and I want to give you a concrete examples of what can be the problem in exchange with Muslims and what can be positive points and how we could work out from that. And therefore, I will let an Oriental Christian speak to you. It will not be my little understanding of things. It will be somebody who was living in the Islamic Empire telling you something and what lesson we can take from there for the future. Thinking in medieval Islamic lands may seem rather remote, but for both Christian and Muslim thinkers, it rested on the quest for truth, as today's thinking should. The quest for truth and knowledge is perennial value for Christians and Muslims. My paper will first highlight the importance of truth and give example of how it is important in Islam. Second, we will move to 11th, 12th century Baghdad, which was then the global intellectual hub in the Islamic lands. Truth led to first trying to explain politely and respectfully to the other matters on which Christianity and Islam disagree, such as celibacy. For that, we will use the Christian Jacobite, lay theologian and philosopher, Yahya ibn Adi. Yahya means John, if you are wondering, trying to justify monastic celibacy. Let us not forget that in 1996, some extremists used a text of the end of the 13th century, a fatwa, an Islamic legal decision, to justify the killing of the monks in Tiberias. But truth also led Yahya and the great Sunni theologian Al-Ghazali, who died in 1111, it's so easy to remember, and who both are very worried about a common enemy, which is an early form of secularism, and how they could work together on that issue is, I think, a certain number of Muslims now are a bit startled that the Christians don't get in touch with them to fight, if you like, the common enemy, secularism. So, first, the quest for truth and knowledge in Islam and Christianity. You have a handout because I know I am using sometimes text people don't know much about. You know all about the importance of truth in Christianity, and I may remind you of Pilate saying, "What is truth?" Which is something that both Muslims and Christians would refuse. The Quran incites people to look for knowledge, and a hadith, i.e. a saying of the Prophet, tells people, seek for knowledge even as far as China. Furthermore, 3 of the 99 beautiful names of God in Islam emphasize truth and knowledge. They are Al-Haq, the truth, Al-Alim, the one who knows, and Al-Hakim, the wise. Al-Ghazali tells us in his autobiography, which is known in English as Deliverance from Error, that he was always seeking knowledge, but while still young, he fell into a deep skepticism, not without some similarities that have been noted to that of Descartes. Al-Ghazali tells us that God himself saved him from absolute skepticism and cured him from this sickness. Once cured, Al-Ghazali explained what it takes to be sure and certain knowledge. It is that in which the thing known is made so manifest that no doubt clings to it, nor is it accompanied by the possibility of error and deception, nor can the mind even suppose such possibility. He gives as example a mathematical truth, that's text T2. For if I know that 10 is more than 3, and then someone were to say, no, on the contrary, 3 is more than 10, as is proved by my turning this stick into a snake. And if he were to do just that, and I was to see him do it, I would not doubt my knowledge because of his feat. The only effect it would have on me would be to make me wonder how he could do such a thing. But there would not be any doubt at all about it. This is a powerful statement of confidence in mathematics, is by the turning of a stick into a snake. Al-Ghazali is, of course, alluding to Moses' miracle, related in the couple of places in the Quran. So, for both Christian and Muslim thinkers, truth is primordial and God is truth. The second part of my paper deals with how to deal with differences and communicate between members of various monotheistic religions. And I have taken as concrete example the question of celibacy or the status of monks. Christianity has always praised celibacy, but in Islam that's not the case. Islam has a very different attitude to celibacy, which it focuses in the Quran on monks. As in the various Eastern churches, there was no impediment for married men to become priests. The Quran is quite blunt and clear. T4. Then we sent our messengers to follow in their footsteps. It's the footsteps of Noah, Abraham, and the prophets. And we sent Jesus, son of Mary, and we gave him the gospel and placed kindness and mercy in the hearts of those who follow him. And monasticism they invented. We did not ordain it to them, only to seek God's contentment. Yet they did not observe it with proper observance. In Islam, of course, invention means a serious transgression when it deals with religious issues. Besides this statement in the Quran, a hadith, or saying of the Prophet, says, there is no monkery in Islam. Obviously, an interreligious dialogue about celibacy between Christians and Muslims cannot rest on scriptural text is they clearly oppose each other. Then what should we do in that case? Yahya ibn Adi may be a model. He's a married lay theologian with at least one son. He supports his family by being a scribe and a translator from Syriac into Arabic. He is a member of what is dubbed the Baghdad School of philosophy, which is mainly Aristotelian, and which included mostly Christians, but also the famous Al-Farabi, a very famous Muslim rationalist who died in 950, who was, of course, a Muslim, and at some stage headed this Baghdad school. Yahya, a Christian, succeeded Al-Farabi as its head and was well used to work with Muslims intellectuals. In one of his most popular philosophical works, The Reformation of Morals, he insists that all human beings should love one another as they share a common humanity grounded in the rational soul, T5. Human beings are a single tribe, related to one another. Humanity unites them. The adornment of the divine power is in all of them and in each one of them. And it is the rational soul. By means of this soul, the human being becomes human. Since their souls are one and love is only in the soul, all of them must then show affection for one another and love one another. In this spirit of truthful dialogue, rational dialogue, Yahya wrote for a Muslim readership of intellectuals a text that Father Griffith titled Colloquy on Sexual Abstinence and the Philosophical Life. It's a text in 3 parts. It reports a colloquy between Yahya, the Christian, and several Muslim interlocutors about the legitimacy of Christian lifelong celibacy. The arguments are philosophical, is a broadly understood Aristotelian philosophy is the common ground on which Christian and Muslim intellectuals of the time can explore an issue such as lifelong celibacy, for which their scriptures present opposite views. This is a complex text, and it begins first by Yahya presenting a little treatise which defends lifelong celibacy against 4 criticism. And then you have an exchange of letters between Yahya and 2 Muslims. Whether the epistolary exchange be a reality or a literary fiction, the tone is always very polite and friendly. This is far from an acrimonious polemics and present people who are seeking the truth. In the first part, Yahya presents 4 arguments by Muslims against the Christian appreciation for lifelong celibacy, which of course he will refute one by one. The first will be our focus, and it's text T6. The adversaries of the Christians say, "We and the Christian agree that God is wise. A true sage does nothing in vain. That is in vain which does not do anything useful or does not undergo anything useful. It is evident that God created the faculty of procreation for human beings. He did not create it in vain, but rather so that something useful would come from it. That which is useful from it is the species permanence and the survival, so to speak, of the world. If this is so, it is evident that anyone who prevents procreation opposes the one who intended permanence of the human species. The one who intends it is God. Therefore, anyone who prevents procreation is God's opponent. Anyone who opposes anything is its enemy and odious to it. Therefore, anyone who prevents procreation is God's enemy and odious to him. But the one who calls to Christianity calls to prevention of procreation. Therefore, the Christian call is God's enemy and odious to him. Notice it's typical, they all are imbued with Aristotelian logic. They have a lot of respect for Aristotelian logic, and therefore they present the argument in this long sorite. The criticism is in that fashion, but let us not be distracted by the focus on procreation. In fact, the context tells you that it's using one word to speak of marriage, raising children, and taking care of a family, and therefore having a job that take all your time. Obviously, some Muslims had tried to explain to Christians why the Quran so clearly rejected monasticism and its lifelong celibacy. The text for this explanation is a formal logical argument, since both Christian and Muslim accept Aristotelian logic. After listing the other three arguments, Yahya tries to deal with this argument. And the way he does it, you can see the importance of philosophy. He argued that the argument is invalid since at least one premise is false or partially false, and therefore the conclusion does not follow. As it stated, he explained, in Aristotle's prior analytics. In the case of the first argument, the one I have used, the false premise is the following. The one who calls to Christianity calls to prevention of creation. Why is it false? Christianity does not universally and absolutely call to prevention of procreation, as he calls it. Rather, it calls everyone for the whole of their life to what is good for them. What is good for them is to look for what increases happiness, namely the true sciences and divine wisdom, which of course means metaphysics, but also knowledge of God. So, and this without ceasing, except when spending time in true necessities. The duties of family life prevent spending all of one's time looking for this happiness and therefore deeper knowledge of God. But not all people are called to renounce family life. Celibacy is not a universal requirement. That celibacy is far from universal requirement, explained in the second part, after the note from the Muslim friend, which raised some objection to Yahya's view, explained in the first part. Yahya, without saying it, follows, up to a point, a Pauline line broadly understood. Celibacy and the raising of a family are not the best for everyone. Celibacy can be the best for some people and raising a family for others. And in 6 cases, he argues that procreation is virtuous. You may be a bit startled by some of those cases. The pursuit of marriage and family life is devoid of any virtue to bring one closer to God when it is devoid of the intention, either 1, to generate a prophet, 2, a just king, 3, a distinguished priest, 4th, a skillful physician, or 5, any intention to eliminate an illness, or 6, to take precautions against falling into sickness which would prevent anyone whom it would afflict from achieving the acquisition of the highest degree of true knowledge of God, of which he is capable. Notice that the last 2 cases of preventing illness are variation on the Pauline theme that it is better not to burn or to be on fire. For Yahya, celibacy is simply a great means to the pursuit of divine wisdom. But as we just saw, in some cases, raising a family will be preferable to celibacy. The argumentation is very philosophical and therefore in some way neutral and ironic. But when Aristotelian philosophy fails to uphold common religious view, Yahya will allude to what is common to the Bible and the Quran. We saw in the first objection that since God created the human race, we must maintain it going on, and therefore should not renounce marriage. Yahya has argued that not all human beings would become celibate or called to be celibate. And as we saw, he thinks that for some, raising a family is preferable. He explained that if per impossibile, all human beings would practice lifelong celibacy, the human race would not necessarily disappear. If, as monotheists say, the world is created out of nothing, and in time, God the Creator might, if he so wish, create human beings without a process of generation, as he did for the father of mankind, Adam, because that's spoken about in the Quran. So, we have that. Yahya does not hesitate to use scripture when it works. But when it doesn't work, he takes refuge in the commonly accepted philosophy. You may think that Yahya's highly philosophical defense of celibacy is rather odd, but in the context of the time, it is not, because they were all enthralled by Aristotelian logic. Even the Sunni theologian al-Ghazali wrote a treatise on logic because he thought that the practitioners of Islamic law were not using good logic in their decisions. I mean, it's a very common ground. So, we need, of course, in this talking with Muslims to find a common language. That's not easy because Muslims are in various areas. and they may not have the same philosophical outlook that we have. So it will vary from one place to another. And also because on the case of the Sunni, you don't have anything that looks like a magisterium and that somebody can speak in the name of Sunni Islam. Sunni Islam is very democratic. They have no clergy. Some special sheikh have some kind of moral authority. That's the case of the one in Cairo at Al-Azhar. But it's not something that determines anything. So truth required that we would face our differences, but also what we truly hold in common. And that's a respect for truth. The Quran strictures on monks did not simply offer an opportunity for interreligious dialogue in the end of the 10th century Baghdad, but it also raised the issue of the legal status of monk in Islamic law. This leads us to Ibn Taymiyyah, who died in 1328, who wrote a very famous fatwa, or juridical determination. It was linked apparently to Ibn Taymiyyah's travel to Egypt at the beginning of the 14th century. Ibn Taymiyyah there explains that the word monk is ambiguous. Monks who in fact are ascetic hermits should be left in peace and not pay the head tax that members of protected minorities have to pay. Monks who live in cities, mingle with people, have a profession and possession, should pay the head tax in time of peace, but could be killed in times of war. Is they spread unbelief? Apparently in Ibn Taymiyyah's time, there were people claiming to be monks, but not really living a proper monastic life, because they wanted to escape the head tax. T8, that's a bit of Ibn Taymiyyah's fatwa. Those who are like the rest of the Christians in their places of living and their intermingling with the people, acquiring goods through trade and farming and craft work and making use of the dwelling of others, for they are distinguished from other Christians only by the errors of their belief, and it makes them leaders of unbelief. For example, doing things like worshipping in impure states. When you go to the mosque for the prayer, you have to make ablution. That's what it speaks of. So, impure state and forsaking marriage and meat and wearing particular clothing, which is a badge of unbelief, because immediately you would see they are Christians. According to them, the only condition for becoming a monk is forsaking marriage. He's accusing some people of taking advantage of the tolerance that real monks, which were more ascetic hermits, did not have to pay the tax. Some extremists use this fatwa as justification for the killing of the Tibetan monks in 1996, even if the Sheikh of Al-Azhar after that condemned that killing. Christianity now certainly needs people who can talk with Muslims. Official interreligious dialogues, I think, most of the time will not work too well. I think what is required is giving an example by one's life, and then real trust develop, even on an individual basis, because they really trust each other and respect each other. So that's something. Now, how can we face together what undermine truth? In the intellectual milieu, the Christian Yahya ibn Adi and the leading Sunni theologian al-Ghazali, who lives a bit afterwards, were facing some challenges arising from some of the Greek philosophical views, while at the same time convinced of the importance of Greek philosophy and of the great value of Aristotelian logic and of the scientific knowledge of the Greek. Most of the philosophers in Islamic land who were physicians, following Galen, who had been a philosopher and a physician. They were aware that the Greeks, the ancient, as they called them, had sought truth, but they had failed to reach it on some issues. So they are choosy. They want to use what is useful, but they want to reject what is not useful. And on that, sometimes the Muslim and the Christian are perfectly in agreement. Al-Ghazali rejected various ancient philosophical tenets in his famous Incoherence of the Philosophers, to which Averroes replied nearly argument by argument in his Incoherence of the Incoherence. And by the way, in Ottoman time, you had the incoherence of the incoherence of the incoherence, and it goes on. So it's a very famous text. Al-Ghazali was not objecting to philosophy per se, but to the overblown claim of Aristotelian, mixed with some Neoplatonism, that the whole of philosophy was absolutely demonstrative. Emilio Prati has shown that the tenets Al-Ghazali rejected on the ground that they were not demonstrative, and they were not in agreement with Islam, and therefore they may have been false, since they were not demonstrative, were already rejected by Yahya, who lived a bit earlier, even if at times not exactly for the same reasons. Here, I would like to focus on one of these issues, necessary emanation and its consequence, the famous question of the eternity of the world versus free creation in time, and God's lack of personal knowledge and care for his individual creature versus personal providence for each human being. Yahya, as we already saw, affirms creation in time. They don't argue about creation ex nihilo against the philosopher, because the philosopher, thanks to Neoplatonism, had introduced creation ex nihilo in Aristotle, if I can put it very roughly. But creation in time, and that it is a free decision of God, and that God, to make the decision and create, knows every individual, that it's not, they always compare emanation, if the sun shining his light and not being aware of it and not choosing on whom it shines. So on that, you have this real agreement, and you can see if you follow the whole different discussion, that obviously the Christian, after a certain time, are aware of some of the argument that the Muslim use, and they may end up using them when they think they are quite good. And you have the Muslim using arguments from the Christian, partially because they have texts of John Philoponus that are lost in Greek. So you have a real attempt to deal with what was, in some sense, an early form of secularism. And how they work together, read each other, to try to deal with that, even if sometimes they deal a bit different. So I think that is something that should make us think. Wherever there are Muslims, and I speak first of the Islamic land, you will need that somebody who has some knowledge of Islamic things, and at the same time you would know what kind of common language of philosophical basis, at least for a discussion between intellectuals, we can use, and that can vary a lot. And I am afraid that Christianity is not really focused about that. It is most focused on showing what's wrong with Islam. Then how can we really enter in some kind of dialogue? And the second aspect is, I think, what will be more important is the witnessing by one's life. And that's not too surprising because, at least in the Middle Ages, the view they have of Aristotle and philosophy is the view that Haddo claimed is philosophy is a way of life. And the Christian had no problem with that because some of the fathers of the church speak of Christianity as a philosophia, meaning a way of life. And that explains what happened with the fatwa of Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah was furious because in some place people who were claiming to be monks were abusing the situation when in fact they were not practicing poverty or anything like that. They simply didn't get married. Maybe they didn't want to get married, or they thought it was easier not to raise a family, and then that's the reaction. I think you cannot have a dialogue if at the same time you don't have a certain intellectual understanding of each other, but it will not lead anywhere if there is not a witnessing by one's life. And that, I think, is something we can never forget. Words are important, but true charity and honesty are what will give more weight to the words. So